Hello book lovers, welcome to Uncommon Reader. My name is Daniela and it's time for the final wrap up of my January reads. I've already spoken about my absolute favorite read in a dedicated video, which was Lincoln Highway by Amortose, and it was my buddy read with Renee of Beyond Books. I also mentioned another interesting read, Arabian Nights, narrated by Kader Adola, in my January favorites, because it was quite intriguing to have all those informations also about how the book was brought to the Western audience. So I'm sharing a lot of those details in my January favorites. And now I have 4 more titles to tell you about, which were quite challenging reads for me. The first book I want to tell you about is If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino. Calvino is one of my favorite authors of the 20th century, and I was quite enamored by the idea of reading this book because I had heard it was dedicated to his wife. But unfortunately, this turned out to be the most difficult read from this author that is quite versatile. He has expanded in his books from fantasy to dystopic, to realism, to sci-fi, to historic novels. So you name it, he can write anything. This, I have to say, was my least favorite book that I've read from him. So let me tell you, this novel plays with the concept of reading and writing, which could be quite amusing for readers. And the story begins with this writer, who is the implicit protagonist of the book, going into a bookstore, purchasing the very same Calvino's book with this title, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. When he's at a bookstore, he notices a woman and he's immediately drawn to her. So, you know, like Italian guys do, he goes and talks to her, and they are both interested in this new release Calvino book. So they purchase it and they exchange numbers so they can discuss the book once, you know, they start reading it. But it turns out that during the read, due to an editorial error, the book that they were reading wasn't Calvino's book. It was some other author, and which turned out to be a book that was unfinished. And so the two set on a quest to figure out what author was that they were reading, because they were curious about the story, how it ended. So at a certain point, they just got into the different book, right? And as they try to solve the mystery, they actually come across some other incomplete stories that keep starting in the book, and then we're left without knowing how the story ends. The chapter of the two readers that in the meantime get familiar with each other are intertwined with the other stories that have a start but not an end. So you can understand how confusing this book was, and at one point I just stopped reading the incomplete stories just to figure out what would happen between the two readers. So I really wanted to do some research and trying to figure out what was the point of the book, because it escaped me. And so I found this that I wanted to read to you. The entire novel explores the relationship between the reader and the text, between the literary game and the reality that becomes increasingly elusive. The book reflects on the nature of narrative itself, on the power of the author, and on the incompleteness of the story, uniting the world of reading and that of the writing in a continuous game of mirrors. So for me, it was definitely not an entertaining book for me. I just couldn't relate to the female reader and the male reader and their story, which was very, very vague. And also, of course, I didn't connect with the short stories that were, you know, without an ending as well. So total no of this book. Another read of January was More Than I Love My Life by David Grossman. I had high expectations from this author. This book, it's actually inspired by a true story. One of Grossman's longtime friend who in the early 50s was held on the notorious Goli Otok prison. The story narrates of three women in three different generations. Vera, who's 90 years old, and she's celebrating her birthday on the day when her daughter Nina, who lives, I believe, in London, arrives in the kibbutz to meet with her and to meet with Gili, who's her daughter, Nina's daughter, and also where she'll meet Rafi, who was a man very important in his life, not Gili's father, but nonetheless they have a really good relationship, Gili and Rafi. And Rafi is still, you can tell, very attached to Nina, but their relationship at the moment, it's sort of influenced by their difficult past together. Nina arrives with some bad news, but also she has some requests, and she's determined to know the truth about what happened when she was only 6 years old, and her mother decided to go to prison, not to betray her then husband, Milos, not Nina's father still. We don't know actually who Nina's father is. And so she accepts to leave her daughter, Nina, at 6 years old, and be imprisoned in this Goli Otok prison for some time. So this was a fact that the family never discussed, and Nina's just tired of it because she feels abandoned. She wants to close some circles, and they decide with the family to all go to Goli Otok on a trip. This trip is the perfect occasion for the family to come together and resolve their differences. There are so many tension in between the women and also between Nina and Rafi. So they also film this trip together because Gili is a filmmaker, and so she's filming just to have a memory of this family reunion despite their differences. So the book is really emotional for Vera, remembering her past and the prison days, but at the same time there are so many family dynamics that they are filled with a lot of resentment, and so the energy in the book, it's very heavy. I really had a hard time reasoning with their feelings, and for them maybe to not be too understanding of one another. They all seem very selfish and not trying to realize and understand what the other person was going through. So I had a really difficult time relating to these characters. At the same time, also, I think the writing was almost theatrical, almost too much of pain, At the same time, since Vera was going back in time, remembering certain things, there was some time jumps that you really not always understood. Also, the dialogues were not very fluent. Overall, not really good experience reading this book as well. So moving on to Han Kang, who won the Literary Nobel Prize last year. And this is her new novel, We Do Not Part. I've read The Vegetarian by this author about a year and a half, which was quite a complicated book, but I did appreciate the writing style. But this book also wasn't a cup of tea or a walk in the park for me. So the protagonist is Jong-ha, who is tormented by a recurrent nightmare, and she has some problems relating to people. So she keeps usually very isolated and works from home. She's a filmmaker, a documentary maker. Since the day when she gets a message from one of her friends and also colleagues, In Sion, who is stuck at a hospital, and this friend asks her to reach her home in a small island to take care of her parrot because he was alone and nobody would go and feed him. So, I mean, don't you have a neighbor? No, whatever. So she asks her friend to reach by plane this little island and rescue her parrot. So Jong-ha comes to the rescue of her friend, and she boards the plane and she reaches this island called Jeju. Unfortunately, at her arrival, we realize that there's a storm going on and there's snow and it's night and the weather conditions are so difficult that she loses the orientation and she cannot find the path to this house where she has been before, but she really is lost. Unfortunately, she falls victim of a little accident, so she falls and slips, and I guess she bumps her head and she faints. And from then on, the book just completely changes because you don't realize after when she wakes up if she is dreaming, if it's real, or if she's just envisioning things. So somehow she reaches this house, and at one point, her friend shows up at the house, and with the reappearance of her friend, a sort of delirium begins, which is none other than the excuse to talk about a terrible chapter in Korean history, which was the massacre of 30,000 civilians between 1948 and 1949. So the memory of this crime that affected Incheon family is reemerged, and so we kind of learn about that story too. At that point, I was so lost because I was more invested in what would happen to Jong-ha and why she was so withdrawn as a personality. So the book took me in a totally different direction where a total new story, total new characters. So Jong-ha became sort of a witness, and I understand what the writer wanted to go to because, of course, it was historical events that really marked the history of Korea. And it would have been nice to be prepared to totally shift gears. I was a bit also confused, knowing how Han Kang would be more inclined to write more intimate stories or very psychological, and in this case, she takes us in a totally new direction. So in a way, I mean, I feel a little guilty not feeling too invested in the historical facts. I didn't understand why they needed to create this sort of dystopic atmosphere where when the friend is at the hospital and then she shows up at the house. I mean, it's just already too confusing, and then to bring out the story of Incheon family. I thought that there were so many different things on the plate. For me, again, this book didn't work really well. So these were 3 difficult reads for me. But let's finish on a high note with So Late in the Day by Keegan. She's the author of Small Things Like These, which I adored, that I read last year. And this book is about 3 short stories, and these 3 stories have in common one thing. They are all filled with subtle, very sneaky violence. You will read about a man who is returning home from work and everything is ready for his wedding, but the home is empty. So who knows what happened? ... Then we'll meet a writer, a female writer, that goes to spend a weekend in a house that hosted the German writer and Nobel Prize winner for literature, Henrik Boll. And he used to write in this apartment. But while she's having a ball in her solitude during this weekend, a man knocks on the door and he wishes to look at the apartment. dot, dot, dot. The last story that was for me the most shocking of all is about a married woman who seeks an adventure and she finds excitement again, but at a high price, dot, dot, dot. What I can tell you is that I am not so fond of short stories, but Claire Keegan is a master of the synthesis, and she can in a page describe a character so well. She will really capture your attention right away, and so I appreciate that so much from a writer. The ability to, with just a few phrases and words and adjectives and through some little actions, these characters come alive, and that's what makes me enjoy reading a lot when it happens. So at least I got some joy in January. And February, it hasn't been that generous, although I do have a favorite so far that I look forward to share in my February favorites. That's going to come up a bit later in the month. In the meantime, I think next video is going to be dedicated to some books that I received as a gift at my arrival here in California, and then for my birthday, which was on the 15th of this month. So now it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for keeping me company today, and I look forward to chat with you in the comments. See you soon here on Uncommon Reader, and in the meantime, happy reading. Ciao.